The Song of Ice and Fire is, as the title suggests, a dance between the physical manifestations of ice and fire. In this sprawling world of war, intrigue and illicit magic, ice is made manifest in the bitter wastes of the land past the wall, and the others who dwell beyond. Fire, however, is made manifest in the form of great-scaled beasts and their platinum-haired riders. In this special long-form video, the entire history of the House Targaryen, where we will cover everything from their earliest origins, their 300-year-long reign over Westeros, and their ultimate demise. Join us as we explore the history of a family whose history so poetically echoes its house words, fire and blood. You might think that fire and blood would make good passwords if you were as Matt Targaryen. The reign of the Targaryens as the royal house of Westeros is a relatively recent phenomenon, beginning around 300 years ago and ending only a single generation ago. However, the bloodlines of the silver-haired dragon riders is much older than that, and to explore the historical roots of House Targaryen's ascendancy, we must go back not centuries, but millennia. To that end, we turn our gaze not onto Westeros, but her sister continent to the east, Essos, where the mighty Valyrian Freehold, the greatest civilization in the history of the world, once thrived. Around 5,000 years ago, many mighty civilizations blanketed the massive landmass of Essos, including the tall men of Sarner, the thousand-jeweled cities of Yeti, and Old Gis, the empire of the Golden Harpy. During this ancient time, the Valyrian Peninsula was the backwater of Essos, with the Valyrians themselves being little more than humble shepherds. This, however, would change when some of these humble sheep herders deigned to brave the slopes of the 14 Flames, a ring of volcanoes on their native peninsula. There, living in those molten craters, the Valyrians discovered the sentient embodiment of power and flame, the dragons. How the Valyrians tamed the dragons is unclear. The process was certainly born of some sort of magic, with some legends claiming said magic was taught to the Valyrians by a vanished people from the Shadowlands of Asai. In any case, within a few generations, the Valyrians were shepherds no longer and soared the great blue atop massive draconic beasts. Bolstered by the limitlessness of the skies and an explosion of magical advancement, the Valyrian Peninsula grew from a forgotten backwater into a vibrant cultural hub. In the titular capital city of Valyria, glittering silver spiral towers reached for the heavens, and the rich and powerful lived comfortable lives, pampered by the comforts brought upon by the innovations of dragonfire and blood magic. Technically speaking, Valyria was never an empire or kingdom, for it had no crowned head. Instead, it was ruled by a council of 24 or so of its most powerful dragon-riding families, making it a freehold. Armed with the fantasy equivalent of weapons of mass destruction, it was inevitable that the Valyrians would eventually expand out their native peninsula with conquest in mind. Ironically, though, their path to imperial expansion began with them being attacked. Wary of Valyria's growing power, the slavers of Old Gis, who dominated most of Essos at the time, marched their lockstep legions to the Valyrian Peninsula 5 times to subjugate them. However, each time, the Valyrians defeated these sons of the Harpy, for they had dragons, and the Giscari had none. In the last of the Giscari Wars, the Valyrians obliterated Old Gis, the ancient capital of Giscari Empire, and annexed the lands around Slavers Bay. There, the Valyrians picked up the habit of slavery from the empire they had just vanquished. In the following centuries, the dragonlords of Valyria would spread their power and influence throughout nearly all of western and central Essos by right of conquest made possible by dragonfire. Around 2,000 years ago, they annexed the northern hills of Andalos. The native peoples of that land, the titular Andals, thus fled in exodus across the narrow sea to Westeros, where they conquered the first men and the children of the forest. To this day, the population of Westeros is of predominantly Andal ancestry because of this, with the exception of the north, where the first men were never conquered. After conquering Andalos, the Valyrians, or more specifically the budding Valyrian colony of Volantis, turned their sights onto Rhoynar, a people who lived in a series of city-states along the titular Rhoyne River, and whose history was just as ancient and storied as Old Gis. Subduing the Rhoynar took the better part of 2 centuries, for the Rhoynish were possessed of powerful water magic which was capable of countering dragonfire. However, about 700 years ago, a massive Valyrian army, accompanied by 350 dragons, the largest number of the beasts ever assembled, completely incinerated the armies of the Rhoynar. After this, a Rhoynish princess, Nymeria, led what remained of her people in an exodus from her homeland aboard 10,000 ships. They sailed west to Westeros, where they landed in Dorne. To this day, the people of Dorne are predominantly of Rhoynish ancestry, marking the second time the conquests of the Valyrians impacted the ethnic makeup of the western continent. Over the next few centuries, the Valyrian Freehold came to stretch over most of Essos west of the Bone Mountains. Great Valyrian colonies such as Volantis, Tyrosh, Lys, Myr, and Pentos became autonomous, self-governing cities under the suzerainty of the capital back in the Valyrian Peninsula, and as such, grew into wealthy and powerful centers of commerce and culture in their own right. The world, it seemed, belonged to the Valyrians, and one could forgive them for believing that the sun would never set on their glorious empire. And yet, doom was on the horizon. Throughout the history of the Valyrian Freehold, House Targaryen was considered a minor power, possessed of dragons, yes, but politically unimportant. In 114 BC, about 400 years ago, a scion of the humble house, Daenerys Targaryen, had a vision in which Valyria was subject to a great destruction. Considering this vision to be prophetic, the Targaryens abandoned the Valyrian capital and moved to the island of Dragonstone on the Narrow Sea. The rest of the Valyrian dragonlords paid them no mind. House Targaryen had always been on the political periphery of the Freehold. If they wanted to move to the geographical periphery of the empire, then so be it. Moreover, they believed Daenerys' apocalyptic visions to be delirious nonsense. They could not have been more wrong. In 105 BC, a great doom befell the Valyrian Peninsula. What exactly caused this doom is unknown, but it was catastrophic. Pillars of hellish white-hot flame erupted from the earth with such heat and power that the capital city was utterly obliterated, and even dragons, creatures born of fire, were incinerated. The peninsula itself was rended, the land breaking apart from intense seismic activity. By the end of the doom, the city of Valyria was no more, and all the Freehold's most powerful dragonlords and their dragons had perished. Although the colony cities Valyria once established, like Lys, Pentos, and Volantis, would survive, the Freehold as a unified state had collapsed, and the dragons they had conquered the world with had gone extinct, with one exception. The Targaryen dragonlords were alive and well on Dragonstone, and so were their massive draconic mounts, making them the last dragon riders in the world. Thus, the world looked upon the Targaryens with trepidation. Would they turn their gaze back east and use their status as the world's last dragon holders to reform the Valyrian Freehold with themselves as its masters? Or would they look west to new lands and new horizons? The Targaryens, with their dragons and their allies, houses Valerian and Solteiger, now controlled the crucial trade routes from Westeros to Essos. Despite this, the dragonlords of Dragonstone took little interest in Westeros for the next 100 years. This would all change with the birth of Aegon, who was born in 27 BC and had two sisters, the older Visenya and the younger Rhaenys. It was Valyrian custom to marry brother to sister, and so Aegon married both. In their youth, the siblings began to occasionally visit Westeros on their dragons as guests of several local lords. Westeros was divided into 7 constantly warring kingdoms. In the north, the Starks ruled from their castle at Winterfell. To the far south in the Dornish deserts, House Martell reigned from Sunspear. The gold-rich Westerlands were dominated by House Lannister, while the neighboring House Gardener held dominion over the fertile lands of the Reach, and the mountainous realm of the Vale belonged to House Arryn. Closest to Aegon's sphere of influence were House Hoare's expansionist kingdom, and that of the declining Storm Kings of House Durrandon. They had once ruled half of Westeros, but their realm had been chipped away at by their neighbors for decades. The leader of Hoare the Black had almost completed a colossal castle named Harrenhal and would soon be able to pursue new conquests in the Stormlands. Fearing this threat, Argilac Durrandon sent an envoy to Dragonstone offering his daughter's hand in marriage along with the land from the God's Eye to the Trident as a dowry, attempting to establish the Valyrians as a buffer between him and the Iron Islanders. However, Aegon instead offered the marriage with his friend and rumored bastard brother, Orys Baratheon. Angered by this insulting proposal, Argilac cut the hands off the envoy and sent them back to Aegon, stating, "These are the only hands your bastard shall have of me." In response, Aegon summoned his friends, allies and bannermen to Dragonstone. The Valerians and Solteigers answered their lord's call dutifully. They were joined by the Emmons and Masseys, who despite being sworn to Durrandons, had closer ties to the Dragonlords. After 7 days of council, a cloud of ravens burst from Dragonstone to all corners of the 7 kingdoms carrying one message. From this day forth there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee would keep their lands and titles. Those who resisted would be humbled and destroyed. In 2 BC, Aegon set sail from Dragonstone with his sisters, 3 dragons and a few hundred to a few thousand retainers. This was the force which landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush and proceeded to encamp on the largest of 3 hills in the area, starting construction of the Aegonfort. The Targaryen would-be king quickly constructed a makeshift palisade and dispatched Rhaenys and Visenya on their dragons Miraxes and Vhagar to secure nearby castles. Rhaenys captured Rosby without a fight and Visenya was attacked briefly until she showed Vhagar's power, and the defenders surrendered. Nearby houses Darklyn and Mooten saw the threat and marched south with 3,000 men to attack Aegon's beachhead. The Dragonlord placed Orys in command of his ground forces while he descended on the enemy from above on his own dragon. the monstrous Valyrian the Black Dread. Both enemy commanders were killed, and these castles bent the knee. After subduing a dozen castles, Aegon summoned their lords. As they had bent the knee, he raised them up and confirmed their lands and titles, while to his oldest supporters he granted council positions. Daemon Valerian was made master of ships, Tristan Massey master of laws and Crispian Sultiger master of coin. Above all others he placed Aerys Baratheon, his greatest confidant, as the first hand of the king. After this, Aegon's knights unfurled a great three-headed red dragon banner breathing fire on a black field. The lords gathered now truly knew Aegon was one of them, and a worthy high king. Queen Visenya then placed a Valyrian steel crown on his head, while Queen Rhaenys hailed him as Aegon, first of his name, king of all Westeros and shield of his people. While those in attendance hailed their new ruler, the Seven Kings of Westeros were preparing for the war that was soon to come. Within days of the coronation, Aegon's armies marched once again in three directions. The Targaryen fleet left for Gulltown and the Vale, accompanied by Visenya. The king thrust northwest towards Harrenhal, while the majority of his forces commanded by Aerys Baratheon crossed the Blackwater Rush accompanied by Rhaenys. Their vanguard was ambushed as they crossed the Wendwater River and they lost 1,000 men before Rhaenys burned their attackers' forest hiding place to the ground. Meanwhile in the north, Aegon and Balerion obliterated King Harren and his entire family by bypassing the walls of the fortress and melting its stone towers. This, and the news that Rhaenys and Meraxes accompanied the Targaryen forces invading the Stormlands worried Argilac, and he began to gather his main force at Storm's End. He wasn't going to meet the same fate as Harren, and so he began his march north to meet the army of Aerys. The airborne Rhaenys witnessed Argilac's departure and the composition of the enemy army, reporting the details back to the hand of the king. Realizing the Storm King's army outnumbered his, he set up a strong defensive position on the hills south of Bronzegate and dug in, awaiting the arrival of his enemy. As Argilac closed on the invading force in the morning, a steady rain began to fall, which then became a howling gale and torrential downpour, turning the ground into a soft mud and also rendering Meraxes unable to fly. The battle of the last storm had begun. Argilac's commanders urged the Storm King to delay his attack until the next day in hopes that the rain would pass. But the Stormlander army outnumbered the army of Aerys 2-1 and had 4 times the amount of armored knights and heavy horses. Angered by the dragon banners flapping on his own hills and noting that the rain and wind was blowing north into the invading army's face, the king gave the command to attack. Argilac's heavy knights galloped through the rain across the mud-soaked battlefield and up the hill, crashing into the Targaryen spearmen at the summit. However, the uphill charge in addition to the sticky mud bogged down the knights' warhorses, and the charge lost its coordinated momentum and cohesion. Giving the order for the knights to pull back to the bottom of the hill, the Storm King led his knights twice more in charges up the hill, attempting to break through the enemy's center. But the assaults became less effective with each attempt as the ground was plowed up by the previous charges. Finally, the battered and broken knight formations were called back to regroup, the Targaryen pikemen only having suffered light casualties. Instead, the king's army sent its spear-bearing infantry up the hill to attack the enemy flank and, with the invaders blinded by the heavy rainfall, they did not see Argilac's men until it was too late. Aerys' archers attempted to shower them with a rain of arrows, but the weather had made their bows useless. The hills anchoring the Targaryen left and right flank fell to the enemy and reserves from the center had to be sent to bolster the line. Then, Argilac led his knights in a final charge up the hill, which broke the enemy center. But they now crashed against Rhaenys and Meraxes, and the Dragon Queen proceeded to slaughter the knights of the king's personal vanguard and one of his commanders with Dragonflame. The other warhorses, frightened by the roaring dragon's fire, panicked and fled in terror, crashing into the riders behind them and turning the charge into chaos. King Argilac himself was thrown from his saddle but continued to battle on the hill. The Targaryen forces now gained the upper hand and Aerys Baratheon charged down the hill towards Argilac, who had slain many soldiers by himself. The invading commander offered a final chance to yield, which was refused. The two now fought, and each wounded their opponent once. After a fierce duel, Argilac was killed, and his army routed. With the army of the Stormlands destroyed, Aerys Baratheon's host marched on Storm's End, which was surrendered by the garrison along with the late king's wife, whom Aerys then married, forming House Baratheon. Meanwhile to the west, hearing of Argilac's defeat, the king of the Rock Lorai Lannister and king of the Reach Myrnix Gardener had combined their forces at Castle Goldenrove, creating the mightiest host the kingdoms had ever seen. The two kings quickly marched northeast through the fields and crops of mid-Westeros. Advised of their march at his camp near the God's Eye, Aegon was able to move south much quicker than his foes, as he had a smaller force. When they arrived at the stony September, his queens with their dragons joined him. The two armies came together on the wide open plains south of the Blackwater Rush, which were covered in dry grass and wheat as far as the eye could see. The sun shone down severely on the unshielded plains and seared the land, as there had been no rain for more than a fortnight. Wind also blew strongly across the flat land. The allied Lannister Gardener army sent scouts to perform reconnaissance against the invaders, and they returned with the good news. Aegon's host was small, and theirs was massive. 32,500 soldiers from the Reach took to the field that day, including several hundred vassal lords of House Gardener and several thousand mounted knights. 22,500 Lannister levies also accompanied them, again with several hundred lords of the Westerlands and several thousand mounted knights. As King Mern had brought more men to the field than King Lauren, he demanded the honor of commanding the center for his house. His son Edmund and himself commanded this armored wedge of knights, while Lorc Oakheart led the left, and the King of the Rock commanded the right flank. In total, this army consisted of around 55,000 troops. Opposite them, Aegon formed up his own army in a crescent facing towards the enemy line. His front ranks consisted of spears and pikemen with archers and crossbowmen behind them, while light cavalry manned both flanks. Most of the soldiers under Aegon's banner were untested and consisted of the levies of the recently allied Riverlords, whose loyalty to the Targaryen cause was far from certain. Outnumbered 5-1, the Targaryen host probably numbered around 11,000 soldiers and was commanded by Jon Mooten, Lord of Maidenpool, while the Targaryen royals circled overhead on their 3 dragons. The two kings sounded their trumpets and began marching forward under a sea of banners. King Mern led the heavy cavalry charge against the enemy center on his golden stallion, while the Targaryen archers and crossbowmen dealt some damage to the charging knights. It was not enough. The first line of spearmen was swept aside and a bloody battle began. The conflict seemed like it would be a massacre in favor of the allied army. But then a great roar was heard, and the 3 dragons began to descend from the skies. Rhaenys set fires in front of the enemy army, the wind blowing the produced acrid smoke towards and blinding them and their mounts, who also began to panic. Visenya and Rhaenys used their dragon flame to cut off any possible withdrawal, while Aegon flew over the massive host and continuously bathed it in flame. The remainder of the Targaryen ground force, who were safely upwind of the conflagration, waited with bow and spear, ready to make short work of the burned and burning men periodically emerging from the inferno. By the end of the day, over 4,000 allied soldiers perished in the dragonfire, and over 20,000 suffered burns, while another 1,000 died by conventional weaponry. The Targaryen force suffered less than 100 dead. King Mern and his entire family perished in the inferno, while the King of the Rock promptly bent the knee to Aegon. The victor marched to secure Highgarden and eventually installed the House Tyrell as the new lords of the Reach.